Morris Lang, who was due to do it, but he had his wisdom tooth taken out last week, and he's suffering the ill effects as a result of that. So Ant has very kindly stepped in. So, as I said, what we're going to do is start off with some comments in general from our three about where we are, and then we'll get into what do we think is already the impact and what we think the future impact is going to be, and I guess how significant do we think this is relative to a bunch of other stuff that the government is also doing as well. So, Anne, do you want to kick us off and just give us a sort of where are we now type of comment, and I'll get Heather and Tom to come in as well. And
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for the introduction, Andrew. So I think it's kind of interesting to think about like the history of the grey belt idea as a concept. And it's sort of moved down the staircase and become a sort of more expansive concept. Maybe the grey belt has loosened over time is maybe a way of understanding it. But if we go back to wind the clock back to May 2023, so when I mean, this is still a period in which Labour had opposed the previous government's planning reforms back in 2020. Their first step towards their current direction of policy of planning reform being really important to their economic strategy was this announcement about building parts of the Greenbelt as early as May 2023. And that was followed a year later by the Grey Belt as announced as a concept back in April 2024, so just before the general election. And it's redefined in this concept of poor quality greenbelt land, right? So it's poor quality scrubland, mothballed industrial sites, things like the Tottenham petrol station in Greenbelt, all kind of key examples here. And at the time, they said they wanted about half of all the housing built on the Grey Belt would need to be affordable housing, social housing. So that was kind of the pre-election pitch. Um, when we after the election and we go through to the first proposal of the NPPF, this is kind of a second step on the staircase. It's still speaking about the grey belt in terms of identifying kind of poor quality greenbelt land, but it really sets out this idea that this is in the NPPF, the grey belt will be defined in terms of its contribution to the purposes of the green belt, and we can maybe go back to those a little bit later for for a bit more discussion. But it's kind of really this kind of connection between it's not just an aesthetic judgment, it's actually related to the strategic objectives of the green belt as an instrument of national policy of urban containment or of trying to prevent the growth of urban areas. And again, you still see this idea that 50% of it will have to be affordable, and there will have to be greenbelt development will be key if the local authority is not going to meet its local housing targets over the next 5-year period. There's a bit of talk then about kind of setting some benchmarks for land values to kind of determine that golden rule element in the consultation, but those haven't been set yet. Fast forward to today, which is kind of like the third step. There are kind of the wider context is obviously housing targets are now higher, they're stronger, they're more important. So it's actually the stick has got bigger in terms of grey belt development and green belt release. But crucially, there's no reference anymore to the kind of the quality of grey belt land. So that kind of concept that it's a aesthetic judgment about a particular site has disappeared, and it's been replaced by this category of land referred to as grey belt, which is connected to 3 of the 5 criteria which are set out as the purposes of the green belt. So essentially, so long as the green belt land is not checking the unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas, so long as it's not preventing neighbouring towns from merging into one another, and so long as it's not preserving the setting and special character of historic towns, and it's also not covered by other designations such as national parks and similar, then a site is very likely to be characterized as grey belt, along with land which has been previously developed at a previous point in time. And the policy is now set out that this grey belt land should be developed ahead of other parts of green belt land which are within a local authority's jurisdiction. And just to kind of wrap up kind of the affordable housing point, the definition now is that any development in the Greenbelt will require 15% more affordable housing than is previously set out in the local plan for other sites. So that 50% has been removed, and there's now a bit more variation according to local land values across the country. So I think it's that kind of evolution from it being sort of this kind of aesthetic, kind of like political construct, which we saw before the election, and how as it has become a more important instrument and tool for national policy making, it's become much more closely bound into really thinking about what the purpose of the green belt is as an instrument of policy and trying to change that from within rather than being this sort of case by case form of judgment about each site. I think it's really interesting, and I'm sure kind of the other panelists have some reflections about what the scale of that is, what they're seeing on the ground at the moment, and what whether that really makes sense as a way to do it.
Brilliant, thanks, and very helpful in terms of the way that the idea is evolved. Heather, add in your thoughts around where we've got to and what does that mean for us, at this moment in time.
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, I'm glad the focus on aesthetics has gone, because if anyone listened to the podcast we did last May, you'll know I wasn't very keen on that.
I wasn't going to
I
suggest that, but you've done it already.
yeah, no. In terms of how effective this is likely to be in meeting particularly the house building numbers, which I think is really the key justification for the policy. I mean, in theory, the NPPF is very helpful, because if you're appropriate development in the grey belt, you no longer have substantial weight against you for green belt harm. You don't have to show very special circumstances. And if you're major development involving housing and you can meet the golden rules, then actually you go the other way and you get significant weight in favour of planning permissions. So the overall structure is very positive. And also, those of you who've analysed the PPG that came out, as you were just saying, and in order to be grey belt, you have to not strongly contribute to purposes A, B, and D. I think it is very sensible for the government to have in effect said you can still be grey belt if you strongly contribute to purpose C, which is safeguarding the countryside from encroachment, and E, which is about recycling urban land, because I've seen it argued several times that all green belt land contributes to those purposes. So if those had been included as well, then it would have made it very difficult to be grey belt, I think. And it's also good and positive that the PPG takes a narrow approach to when you will be making a strong contribution to purposes A, B, and D. So the potential for sites to be grey belt and to sort of hit the initial definition is quite broad. There's then the requirements around being not inappropriate. The first one is you've got to not fundamentally undermine the purposes of the remaining green belt in the plan area. I don't think that's likely to be a problem to begin with, but eventually, presumably, the point will come where a local planning authority just says, thanks very much, but no, we've had enough grey belt now. I have some sympathy for the view that some commentators have expressed that analysing what the impact will be on the remaining green belt is something that would be better done at plan making stage rather than for every application. The point, and this is the first of a couple of points where I see some tension actually in how the policy might operate, is obviously small sites presumably are least likely to come unstuck against this requirement of not fundamentally undermining the rest of the green belt. But if you're not in a sustainable location, so you've got poor public transport access, for example, what you really need is a large site to fund and provide a solution to that rather than a small site. It's very difficult in my experience for a small site to make its location sustainable. It either is or it isn't. The other point, which Ant touched on already, is there's this elevated affordable housing contribution, which is up to 50% for major development involving housing. And the NPPF says that the use of site-specific viability assessment should be subject to what the PPG says. And all the PPG says at the moment is we're going to update this, but at the moment you shouldn't be undertaking site-specific viability assessments. So on the face of it, as matters stand, you're only going to be able to benefit from grey belt policy if you're a major site with housing, if you can viably provide the elevated affordable housing contribution. Now, how much of an obstacle that's going to be in practice, I don't know. Happy to hear from others on the call who do. But in terms of whether the quality of the outcome of this policy is likely to be good in terms of, positive and appropriate planning, I think two final points. Again, there's this issue around making a strong contribution to purpose A in particular. So the PPG says, in effect, if you're a site that's not adjacent to or near a large built-up area, then you'll probably be okay. That's completely logical given what the purpose is, but I don't think that approach is apt to enable the most sustainable locations to come forward. And this is a point we touched on when we were discussing this last year. So again, the more you're in the middle of nowhere, the more likely you are to be grey belt. but then also the more likely you are not to be in a sustainable location, and so you can't be appropriate development in the grey belt. So that I think is another tension. The final point I would make is, there's been a lot of people questioning whether this means that local planning authorities have had control taken away from them. They need to get on and do their own grey belt assessment. I think I appreciate fully the point that the House of Lords has made in the Built Environment Committee, that they're obviously very resource constrained, but local planning authorities that do undertake their own assessments, I think, will put themselves in a much stronger position going forward to sort of work out which sites they think legitimately are green belt. And conversely, obviously, site promoters should and have been getting in quickly to try and get ahead of the analysis that local planning authorities have been asked to undertake.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. The sort of interesting one as to how long do you think maybe we'll come back to this, how long do you think the sort of transition period from guidelines to to detail, and how does that get filled in? I think would be an interesting sort of issue to explore. Tom, give us your views on where we are now, where we've got to.
Thanks, Andrew. I think I'll take a very quick kind of step back, particularly for the non-planners who are listening in. I don't know how many of you there are, but I think the first kind of basic point of principle is that the green belt isn't necessarily green, and the grey belt is definitely not necessarily grey. The green belt was introduced basically to stop cities growing, or large urban areas growing and merging. It's not an environmental designation. I think the government's view with the 1.5 million target was that the green belt was going to have to be reviewed in most conurbations, and it's made the changes to the NPPF and the planning practice guidance, which effectively require people to plan to meet need, and saying that planning to meet that housing need is an exceptional circumstance requiring them to review their green belt. So the government's kind of starting point, and if you listen to Matthew Pennycook talking about it, he'll say they want the system to be plan-led. They want it to be locally led. They want local authorities and, in due course, strategic authorities to do their green belt reviews and release green belt in an organised way. So that's the starting point to where they're coming from. But at the same time, they want things to happen quickly, and those things don't happen quickly in the planning system usually, particularly if you wait for large strategic plans to be made. So the green belt designation, in effect, has become something that incentivizes authorities to do their own green belt review by effectively pre-releasing some of their green belt under certain circumstances. And the tests that are used for that are effectively the tests that the local authorities or strategic authorities should be using for their green belt review anyway. They are the sites that they should be considering removing from the green belt through the local plan process. But what grey belt does is allow people who own those sites or are promoting those sites to bring those sites forward earlier through the planning process and get some growth going and get some house building going in return for a good slug of affordable housing and other contributions. And that is how effectively the policy is set up. So I think the House of Lords didn't really get their head around how that kind of process worked, with their criticisms of the process, which were that the green belt reviews was going to be much more important and the grey belt may not be that significant in terms of housing numbers. I think that's the intention, provided that people do their green belt reviews. So we're in the early stages and we're seeing a lot of green belt appeals, and we're also seeing some local authorities giving planning permission for things which are defined as grey belt, and they're accepting a defined as grey belt. So it's having that early loosening effect. But in the longer term, I think the strategic green belt reviews, including in London, are going to be the most significant and kind of the big prize for the government in terms of numbers.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you very much. And as always, if you've got questions, comments for Tom and or Heather, based on what they're saying, or things that you're coming across as well, just pop them in the Q&A, and I'll try to push them into the conversation as we're going along. Let's start. Well, let's sort of carry on where you just finished. Tom. Heather, maybe you kick us off. What's the impact already? As Tom said, you can see already through, decisions now are being made or revised already because of that, because of the grey belt introduction. Just do we have a sense as to the quantum and the nature of some of the effects already?
I'm not sure in terms of the overall quantum of actual, particularly housing units, whether anyone, hopefully if someone has, they can put it on the chat, but I haven't seen anything that kind of adds up, all the units that have been consented on a grey belt basis. I know there have been several appeal decisions, including residential development, also actually infrastructure coming forward. So it is, as Tom said, it is already, 3 months in, having an immediate effect. I think, as one would expect, given that I agree, this is really, it seems to be a sort of a political driver to kind of, push local planning authorities to do a proper review of their green belt and to get things moving at a sort of strategic plan making level. And this is really just kind of the sort of interim solution, I think. So we are still seeing a lot of differences in the outcomes because it is quite discretionary. There's still lots of room for planning judgment to be exercised by the council or by the inspector. And so decisions are going both ways, but overall, my understanding, having analysed it, is that actually more of them, I think, are being kind of positive in terms of the outcome than are falling down, which I think indicates that the policy is working effectively.
Yeah. Tom, come in on this. I mean, you started to say you've seen some decisions already, both through the appeals process, which I assume is obviously led by the developer or the builder, but also some local authorities themselves bringing that sort of forward. So there's dynamics going on from both sides, as it were. But just some sense as to what are we seeing already?
Yeah, I mean, bear in mind how early days this
Yeah.
is and how long it takes to get things to committee or appeal. So we only got the December NPPF kind of confirmation of the final policy, and we only got the PPG that Heather was mentioning in February. And in fact, I think there are some views on the one big grey belt scheme that was refused inquiry in Beaconsfield, that had that been taken after the PPG was updated in February, it might have been a different decision. So the PPG pushes it even kind of further down that line. There was there was an assessment done by, I think, Marron's, one of our competitors, but I'm happy to mention them because it looks like good work, where they're saying that the success rate is 10 percentage points higher for Greenbelt appeals than had previously been for similar appeals. So that has clearly increased. And there are 3 or 4 examples of local authorities in, particularly in the southeast, kind of metropolitan Greenbelt outside London, where they've been very slow to make local plans. They've got very low 5-year housing land supply, and they have made positive planning decisions at committee because there's no point contesting it at appeal. It so clearly meets the requirements. So it is having an effect. If you look at the numbers, they're very low. As I think Heather implied earlier, it's easier for small sites to meet it than it is for large sites to meet it. Because it's in part about the kind of impact on the green belt as a whole. So if a lot of the appeals are 3, 4, 5 homes, cumulatively those things can be really positive, and really positive for small house builders and diversifying the market. So I wouldn't kind of underplay the importance of lots of small consents. And also, as Heather points out, probably kind of nearly half of the appeals have been for kind of solar or truck stop or various different travellers sites, various different things, because it isn't limited to housing. And in fact, it's probably easier for some of the commercial development to meet the golden rules tests, because effectively, obviously, the really onerous one, the 50% affordable housing or 15 percentage points above local plan, can't apply to developments that aren't providing housing. So economically, it actually is a bigger incentive for non-residential uses in some ways because of the way that that's set up. But the numbers are small at the moment. I think the excitement of some of the barristers, although not Heather, on LinkedIn about the number of appeals that are coming forward at the moment indicates that this is going to be a very active area over the next kind of year or two at least.
Yeah, I'll bring Ant in a second. Heather, why aren't you excited? Why aren't you, licking your lips and rubbing your hands at the, the thought of these wondrous appeals coming in? What do you know that no one else does?
No, internally, I'm very excited. I just wasn't on LinkedIn at the time.
You're just hiding it very well.
Yeah.
And your thoughts on this? It's interesting. I mean, you touched on this, Tom. I wonder whether there's a geography to this in terms of, quite a few of these, not exclusively, are in and around the Greater Southeast, where housing need is very, very large, which is part of the consideration, I suppose, to some degree as well. And just your thoughts on the impact already?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what Tom said is right. That's what I've been hearing as well, is that it's these Greater Southeast authorities that haven't had a local plan in place, have very low house building numbers, and have essentially been marched up the NIMBY Hill and need to be marched down again in some form or another. And at least insofar as, the local plan making process is going to take time, especially new NPPF coming forwards. As Heather was saying, what was kind of interesting about the Grey Belt as an idea and as a principle is it's not just delivering housing in and of itself, site by site, but it has this connection to the local plan making process, whereby it is an incentive to get your local plan done and agreed, particularly in these places where it's historically been very difficult. But also as part of the plan making process, authorities are going to have to identify Grey Belt sites of their own. I guess I imagine this some of the contention in the system is going to be about how much Grey Belt is identified within local plans as they get agreed and get presented to the ministry. But that double lock and on the site as an application, but also in the local plan making process, I think it's going to be quite a powerful and interesting mechanism for housing delivery.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely come on to that. The initial reactions that we're seeing, or is it a bit of a sort of sugar rush, sort of immediate responses, and then do we think it'll settle down, or do you think this sort of thing will continue on until other things come into play, either local plans catch up? How do you think about the immediate effect? Is it just the initial surge, or is there something more than that, Heather?
Yeah, I think it is a sort of, not that it will go away completely, but I think it is an initial surge, not least because there is in the policy this point around the impact on the rest of the green belt, and so I just think that that sort of expressly brings in a kind of time limit in a way. There will come a point, I think, where certain authorities in particular are just going to turn around and say, no thanks, we've had enough. And independently of that, it seems to me that sort of the political underpinnings of this, appear to be, okay, let's loosen it, and try and get local planning authorities to crack on and sort their plans out and deal with this strategically. So I'd be surprised if the level of enthusiasm everyone else, apart from me, has been showing is still going, in 5 years' time.
Tom, do you come back in? I'm interested in your thoughts around, obviously, as we said at the beginning, you've said it, others have said, Grey Belt is one aspect of what the government's. How does this interact with, the increased numbers as well, in a sense, going for the 1.5, the 370 or 380 per year, etc. Notwithstanding what the OBR said last week in the spring statement, or the fiscal report associated with it. How do these two things sort of interact, and what does that mean, I suppose, for Grey Belt as we look beyond the initial reaction?
I think there are various interactions. So one of them is, as I said at the outset, that the meeting housing need is now an exceptional reason to review Green Belt. And Grey Belt is part of that kind of review. So, and the housing numbers in the southeast are particularly high, and higher than have previously been accommodated in local plans. So the Green Belt pressure part of it is immediately there, and people are looking at that. If you look at London, where the mayor has to go from 52,000 to the high 80s a year, has to find 30,000 a year additional capacity for housing. the previous London plan review and the inspector's report suggested that anything much above where we are now would need a fundamental Greenbelt review. The government have agreed to fund a Greenbelt review. 4 of the boroughs have said they don't want to take part in that Greenbelt review and will do their own in Outer London. So we'll see where that lands in terms of strategic planning. I would have thought that the Metropolitan Greenbelt, if anything was strategic in London, the Metropolitan Greenbelt is strategic, and it should be the mayor doing it. But we'll see where that lands. But that pressure is there and will be a key feature of plan making, particularly in the southeast, but not just in the southeast. I'm sitting here in Leeds, which has a quite restrictive greenbelt around it. York has a restrictive greenbelt. Just done a greenbelt review, but now has a higher number than when it did its greenbelt review. So this is going to be a feature. It will be a political challenge, I think, and I think one of the reasons why planning by appeal on the green belt or grey belt may be a sudden kind of sugar rush and then tone down a bit is when we get into kind of election period, even a government with a high majority towards the kind of 4th and 5th year, that becomes an issue. And I noticed that the Reform Party were setting up a new think tank, and their first piece of work is how to resist new housing development and greenbelt housing. So the politics of it is certainly not going away. The politics of it in the southeast is not going away. If you then look at the kind of the grey belt aspects of it, many authorities, well, some authorities will go very slowly on their greenbelt reviews in the hope that they'll never have to implement them because there'll be a change in policy or change in government. And what grey belt does is keep that pressure up, because even if they don't do the policy, the grey belt mechanism is effectively making them accept housing either through local consents or through planning appeals. And then linked to that, one of the triggers for the grey belt is the housing need, and that's based on 5-year housing land supply and the housing delivery test. And those new housing numbers go into that test in the first place. So over time, particularly as those numbers tighten on people, they will again add weight to appeals and open up the opportunity for more people to go for grey belt proposals through application rather than through green belt release. Yeah. So all of these things are integrated. I mean, the House of Lords report said there's lots going on. These things are integrated. You don't know what you're doing. I actually think this is one area where the government does know what it's doing and has designed this in quite an intelligent and clever way to do that.
Brilliant. Well, it'd be interesting. We'll come back in a second to how the industry, I suppose, broadly defined, is also then thinking about it. And just adding your thoughts on, there's an interaction, as Tom was saying, between, the housing need numbers are just much, much bigger, and they in themselves create a dynamic which then feeds through into grey belt, etc. Which is, I think, is as Tom was saying, is a kind of interesting way of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think it's definitely where housing targets increased the most was particularly those shire areas around the big cities, particularly in the greater southeast. Relatively, the targets were introduced, arguably from an unfeasible level, in kind of the big urban areas where the green belt won't be as effective in increasing densification, almost by definition. But the borough is certainly higher in a lot of these kind of more district councils, kind of rural shire seats around the big cities. I think there's kind of an interesting dynamic possibly on the way where, if this does mean that we end up hitting our housing targets out in the shires at some point over the next 5 years, that then turns the housing targets much more into a kind of cap rather than into a floor, which is what they notionally are supposed to be. So if we have a period in which actually there's so much grey belt release happening that these shire districts, they reach their housing target, they can satisfy their housing delivery test, how that then gets reconciled into future grey belt release and future development and development beyond their target to meet local and regional need, I think becomes quite interesting. That'll be something for the government to consider over time. But also there's this kind of question about urban house building needs as distinct from kind of city region kind of house building need, which includes that kind of urban expansion element. If we have a greenbelt policy that is still notionally committed to stopping the expansion of the big cities, are we going to get as much grey belt release as we like? Are we going to get as much development as we like? As Heather alluded to, some of those areas right next to the big cities are going to be the most sustainable locations for new development. But also the government is going to have to, I think they are aware of this. They've sort of got a suite of policies they've introduced that will increase shire house building over the next 5 years. But where's the intervention that's going to come to increase urban house building, particularly in the big cities, not just in their own right, but as contributions to the national target?
Yeah. Heather, come in on this issue. I suppose also be interested in your thought on, how you think about the golden rule element, particularly obviously on residential. And Tom's point, there will be a particular geography to that, because 50% or up to 50% will have some issues around viability, the ability to actually provide the 50% in weaker housing markets. And so there's a bit of a dynamic going on there, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. But just a more general, the interaction between the bigger numbers and then the grey belt process.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Tom. I do think the government knows what it's doing. I think it has devised grey belt policy as a way to sort of bring forward, as we've been discussing, probably smaller sites, and then it acknowledges that it's really plan review that might move, and new towns as well. There are other policies that will really move the dial in terms of larger sites. So I think it is coherent as an approach, as far as I can see. I mean, Ant's point around what's going to go on in urban areas, I think, is an interesting one. The mayor's response to the Enfield local plan was really illuminating. He's kind of, I think, now obviously accepts the principle that there is a need for greenbelt release, but it's obvious he wants to make released sites work really, really hard, which, is commendable. I would hope no one would be taking the opposite view. So there is still that focus as well, I think, in the NPPF around, focusing on brownfield, and particularly for greenbelt plan review, you've got to have looked at all the other options and made brownfield sites work hard. And I think what I thought was interesting is the NPPF says that the golden rules will apply to greenbelt review as well. So that's a little bit odd, in that for locations where there is a difficulty around viability, that's actually potentially introducing an obstacle that wasn't there before, because previously you just had to have exceptional circumstances, and that may or may not have had a sort of, you've not provided enough affordable housing angle to it. But yeah, that to me is a bit strange, in that if viability, at the moment, until we get the new PPG on viability and we see what that has to say about site-specific assessment, and hopefully it'll be more facilitative of that. But as things stand, in areas where there is a problem around viability, that's going to be a problem for plan review as well as for, grey belt applications. So that for me is an aspect that I think does need some more thought. And I am actually very enthusiastic about the viability PPG when that comes forward. Might do a LinkedIn post.
Very good. Very good. Tom, come in on this, because how does the requirement, the golden rule requirement, is going to bite in some places, and actually, as Heather said, potentially offers an obstacle for then taking the scheme forward, even if it has to, as it were, or the conditions are met. What's your thought on that? I mean, what's your thought on that? What do you think there'll be ultimately much more flexibility or variation around the golden rules as applied in, say, London and the southeast? Very hot housing markets versus elsewhere.
I'll start by saying that my comment about Heather not banging on about this on LinkedIn was in no way a criticism. She has some quite excitable colleagues. But in relation to the viability aspect, I think there's again something as part of a wider trend, is that the government is clearly looking to secure more of the benefit of the uplift in land value created by the allocation of sites for housing that weren't previously allocated for housing for public benefit. And that will be linked to the new towns as well. And I'm sure that the viability assessment and the viability guidance will kind of reflect that. And in some ways, it's potentially quite a kind of radical position, and over time, a radical change. So I think that is going to be interesting to see, one to watch out for, really, because I do think they're serious about getting more out of it. As indeed, I mean, the CPO legislation, for example, there was a little bit in the bill that's just been published, but actually it was the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act that dealt with fundamentally with the hope value issue, which was Michael Gove. So I think there's almost a kind of semi-cross-party consensus that we should be getting more out of land value for infrastructure and development. And I don't think that one's going to go away. And it will be an ongoing tension with trying to hit the housing number while trying to shift the land market, particularly on greenfield sites. And I suppose the fundamental point about the green belt and the grey belt is that, in theory, they should have had lower land values in the first place because they were so restricted. And therefore, if you let them begin to be traded on the basis of a kind of market scheme value, and you let that happen at the beginning, you lose the ability to benefit from those land value uplifts later on. So that's going to be a really interesting one, I think, to watch. And I think they're kind of trying to straddle those tensions on the viability. I think on the green belt and the green belt in different places, it's still greenfield sites, and the value of greenfield sites for farmland, i.e. their existing use value, doesn't vary enormously across the country. It varies depending on the quality of the land, but it doesn't massively vary depending on the location, unlike brownfield sites. So I'd kind of be less concerned about that issue and the greenbelt release being a big barrier to development unless you're getting up to the very high end, and the 50% clearly is enormously challenging in a lot of places. And I expect the guidance to encourage authorities to set appropriate rates through the local plan that may not be at 50%, and often aren't. But I think that will be kind of a bit more nuanced.
Heather, your thought on that? Because it's a good point on that.
Yeah, I would like to see that. I think, in my experience, not to say that there isn't a role for site-specific viability, but once that role's there, then it sometimes does become difficult to kind of, really get anything meaningful in terms of affordable housing at all, just because the viability on a particular site can be very difficult. So I think the suggestion that the sort of most effective way forward would be for local planning authorities to really think carefully about what percentages work in their area is a good one.
And not a sense that higher affordability requirements might be used to prevent development from happening because they just, they're not prepared to be a bit more pragmatic. Is that a likelihood, Heather? What do you think?
I don't think so. I'd really hope not. I mean, well, maybe I'm being naive. Perhaps there are, some corners of the country where, people will just really try and turn their faces very deliberately against grey belt release. But I mean, I don't know. There's no point building houses if people can't afford to live in them. And there's a really sort of smackingly obvious need to build houses that people can afford to live in. So optimistically, I'm going to hope that no one does take that approach. But yeah, that might be, as I said, a little bit naive.
Okay. And coming not on that particular, issue, but just the interaction between the sort of questions and issues around affordability, as required as, and then, but also the desire, demand for, for development to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting, wasn't it? Because we did quite a bit of research on the Morris really led on it, so it's a shame he can't, speak to it more clearly today. I think we've identified there is this tension in a little bit in our own thinking as well as kind of government policy, whereby when you look at the kind of Section 106 process in normal urban house building up and down the country, it is increasingly, I think, a barrier to viability and development, and for a lot of currently stalled sites, certainly within London. But also we see that it is not in a strategic sense. It is not actually placing affordable housing, subsidized house building in exactly the places where we need it, right? So, whether you look at any metric across council housing waiting lists, in terms of rents, in terms of quality of housing, we've seen that the current process for delivering affordable is concentrating affordable housing in the places where private house building is high. So it's simply following the private sector rather than complementing it, rather than doing something distinct and different, which is where the strategic case for subsidized affordable housing is clearly strongest. I guess with the grey belt changes, I guess we're seeing a bit of we'll see some following, I suppose, with a 15% uplift above local plans requirements for affordable housing going forwards. I guess it'll be interesting to see how does government, once this becomes live and vivid, and we get a strong picture of what type and what amount of affordable housing is being delivered through the grey belt process. What does that then mean for governments thinking about affordable housing more generally and council housing? Do they think that this can play a strong enough and more supporting role alongside changes to subsidized affordable housing in urban areas? Will there need to be, will the current system in urban areas be able to remain in its current form? Will it need to change? That's something to watch out for, I think, alongside any changes directly to planning.
Yeah, yeah. Let's have a sort of think about how it interacts with another bit of the government's housing stroke, growth agenda, which is the conversations around new towns or urban extensions. Because Heather, you said at the beginning that at the minute you can see how some of the smaller schemes, will manage their way through the process by definition, but some of the bigger settlements, bigger schemes, we're going to need to think about them in a slightly different way, and they'll probably have to become part of the review process. But obviously, we've got the government obviously interested in reasonably large urban extensions, stroke new towns. Call it what you will. How do you see that sort of bit of the government's agenda interacting with this bit of the government agenda? How significant does grey belt and/or green belt review become in terms of delivering the new town stroke urban extension agenda that the government's also set itself?
Yeah, I mean, and so far as I can sort of try and read between the lines, they seem to me to be have been put forward as complementary to each other. So, grey belt to facilitate not just smaller sites, but probably in reality to facilitate, smaller sites coming forward. Green belt release, I think particularly, in outer London, where you wouldn't be talking about a new town because London's there. So green belt release on the edge of existing large settlements potentially, and then new towns. I mean, I just think we need everything. The numbers are so large. I think I did find it interesting when I was looking into this to see the sort of estimates in terms of residential units that are likely to come forward over grey belt, and it went from, I don't know, I think it was 50,000 to 4 million or something. So I have no idea
we don't know, right?
which of those is accurate, but yeah.
When the scale is that long or that big, we just don't. That means we don't know, right?
No. So yeah, in default of somebody convincingly saying with some evidence, these are the grey belt sites and they will solve the housing crisis, I just think it has to work in tandem with green belt release and particularly with new towns.
But in terms of the this bigger developments, the scale of those developments then begin to, by definition, get at or undermine, however you want to call it, some of the reasons for the green belt, in its sense of what it's meant to do. So how do you see that getting reckoned? If you're going to build 10 or 20,000, by definition, that is going to have a material effect on the expansion of that place, and/or has a material effect on the nature of the green belt itself. So how do you see it? How do you see that playing out? Is that dealt with through grey belt, or is that dealt with through something else?
I think that would be green belt release. So it'd be exceptional circumstances, golden rules, as we've already discussed. I can't really see a way at the moment, and certainly grey belt policy doesn't necessarily provide one, to have a sort of absolutely enormous settlement kind of coming in the middle of nowhere where there's no, you've just got no public transport access at the moment. I think the local council would say, this is not a sustainable location. It's a site in the middle of nowhere, and we're happy to take this forward, but you'll have to wait for our plan review.
Yeah. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, going back even further back to first principles, the last time the private sector built the number of homes that the government would like to see a year was the 1930s, and the Greenbelt was specifically established to stop the 1930s from ever happening again.
Correct.
So how do those two things kind of square against one another? I think Heather's absolutely right. Certainly building at scale, anywhere near virtually all of the big cities will not meet the to check unrestricted sprawl of large built up areas test. So it's never going to be grey belt. It's going to have to be release of green belt and or some national designations, potentially through the New Towns Task Force, and where new towns get to. I suppose the more difficult aspect is that in some ways sustainable development is through incremental urban extension that benefits from existing infrastructure and doesn't need to do all of the new infrastructure and everything else at a scale above the 5 and 10 homes type development. And that isn't really facilitated through grey belt, probably at the scale that would be helpful, but isn't something that people like looking at in green belt reviews either. They want big chunky things, and the mayor has indicated, I think the point that Heather was making about the Enfield local plan inquiry, where the mayor's officer went along and effectively said, you know that we said you shouldn't do greenbelt release. Well, actually, we now think you can do greenbelt release, but not this greenbelt release, different greenbelt release. And the mayor's approach is saying we effectively want to do concentrated, medium to high, not high density in the sense of towers, but medium kind of density, concentrated developments as part of greenbelt release, which I think I agree with Heather is a good idea. But actually, in terms of volume of numbers, you do need some incremental stuff as well, and that's the bit that is not really dealt with through any of the reforms at the moment, I don't think.
Yeah, that's very good. And coming on this.
Yeah, so I think kind of keyword Heather used there was complementary, right? I think what's kind of complementary about what the government's, but the New Towns agenda and the kind of the grey belt, green belt agenda is actually kind of the residual green belt that still remains within the NPPF and indeed across the country, and particularly that purpose that Tom alluded to about supporting the urban containment of big cities. If you go back to the creation of the 1947 planning system, it was very clear in this vision of urban development that we would have across England, where the big cities would not be allowed to grow and urban house building would be satisfied in the greater southeast through the delivery of new towns as completely separate and distinct economic units and communities with no connection to the big cities. I think kind of what's interesting about government policy is the economic imperative from governments. There is a clear understanding that the role of the big cities in the national economy means that they need to succeed for the entire national economy to succeed. We're seeing government come forward with brownfield passports proposals and other means to think about how they can increase house building in urban areas. There will probably, as Tom said, there'll be kind of concentrated elements of small urban extensions on the periphery of the big cities is what I would expect to see. But insofar as the grey belt is a success, but it will also have limitations. Where the conversation is going to move to next, I suspect, is going to be about, well, to what extent should we have a policy of urban containment around our big urban areas? If we are genuinely serious about house building and planning reform, not just meeting a target, but supporting a national economic strategy and improving living standards across the country, we are eventually going to need to have a debate about to what extent are we going to continue to prevent London in particular, but also other big cities, from growing and having the suburbs that their housing markets are screaming at us that they need to have.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And obviously it's a debate and a discussion that we have quite often in different contexts. Heather, just given where we are and obviously uncertainties, but nevertheless, we were talking a little bit before we came on air, a little bit about how the industry is already thinking about the set of proposals and set of ideas that the government has set out. Obviously, we don't know how it's all going to play out over the next few years, but just given where we are, what's the sort of sentiment in in the industry broadly defined as to the proposals that have been laid out? I guess, on the one hand, there's the development community broadly defined, and then obviously there's planning authorities as well. What's your sort of summing up of the sort of sense of the sentiment?
I think very positive from site promoters. As I said, unsurprisingly, because overall I do think the policy that's come forward in the NPPF is positive, and particularly the approach in the PPG to kind of supplement that is helpful. Local planning authorities, I actually haven't spoken to anyone at one of them about this yet. I suspect they're just thinking, oh, great, yet more things that I have to think about. And I think it was unavoidable in the sense that this grey belt policy is supposed to be, loosening policy restrictions kind of in advance of plan making, but it does innately mean that local planning authorities will have to look in quite some detail. There's things like this footnote 7 aspect where you're going to have to work out before you can even figure out whether something is or isn't grey belt, let alone whether it's appropriate or inappropriate development, let alone whether the golden rules are satisfied. You're going to have to work out whether you've got a heritage issue that gives a strong reason for saying no. So it's not the most straightforward policy, particularly in contrast with something that just says, oh, they're very special circumstances, reach a view. I do think it will ask quite a lot of local planning authority officers, unfortunately.
And are they not individually in terms of their own capability, but is the system up to the task that has now been given, Heather, at the minute?
No, frankly, there's, everybody knows there's a resource problem. There still is, I think. I mean, obviously, I've not sat down with a calculator and worked out how much the extra funding equates to, but I did read something that says they think it's one extra staff member per local planning authority, which I doubt is going to be enough. I mean, this is again a problem that relates to geography, and that the problem's more extensive in certain areas than in others. I mean, I think more positively, actually, for local planning authority officers, those who would like to see more development, and particularly more housing development, come forward but are just stymied by their committee members, will probably welcome this, I hope, with open arms, because a lot of it is around just kind of changing the narrative politically in terms of greenbelt. So from that perspective, I hope it's very useful to them.
Yeah. Tom, come in on this, on the issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other one, I agree with everything that Heather just said. I think the other thing is the capacity of the planning inspectorate to deal with the various things that are being thrown at it. I think they do a brilliant job, but if there are going to be a significantly increased number of these types of appeals, they've also got on the other side of the fence examining all of these new local plans and potentially spatial development strategies and everything else. So there's clearly a capacity issue there. And I know that they're working to address that and have done well so far in doing so. But these things are going to provide challenges, and particularly the more stuff that goes through appeal and the more stuff that goes to inquiry when it goes through appeal will add pressure to the system and at the same time to local authorities as well. So that is going to be very challenging.
And notwithstanding that, Tom, sort of broad sentiment about, particularly from the industry side, as to moving in the right direction, etc. They can see what's required. I mean, what's your sense as to where the industry is currently?
Yeah, I think again, I agree with Heather's point. I think they're broadly positive about it and worried about the viability bit, as usual. I mean, it kind of standard stuff about planning reform, really. Probably, I mean, most of our clients are bigger, so it's not like we're doing a whole spate of kind of grey belt appeals, but because the policy relates to other types of sites, I think there's a little bit of concern from developers of strategic sites, i.e. the really big ones with the really big upfront infrastructure costs, that they're going to get hit with viability, the kind of viability tests that are relating to sites of 2, 3, 4, 10, 20 homes that don't have to provide a load of infrastructure up front to open up the site. And they definitely do need to be kind of treated differently, but generally it's positive, I think.
Yeah. And your sort of thoughts on the sort of sentiment where we are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that political mood music, right? There's the fact the policies have changed, which is obviously a very positive direction of travel. But what I'm hearing from developers and industry is, well, the sense that a different political approach is being taken, on these questions of planning, of house building, of greenbelt, is itself a material factor in changing the decision making of local authorities, of planners, and indeed of developers on the ground, which I think is positive, right? I think it means that I think we can be hopeful that the impact of the government's new direction on planning and house building will have benefits, I think, sooner than a simple by the book assessment of policy and how that feeds into decision making might result in. And the flip side of that then, though, is if there is a change in political direction at some point in future, as there inevitably will be, how durable are the changes that the government has implemented in their period of energy and reform in this area? Obviously, the grey belt changes are quite significant. I think will be, it seems to me, slightly difficult to undo, certainly in a complete form. But how do we make the rest of the agenda sticky and permanent is an important one for the government.
Yeah, got a couple of minutes left. Stars, just a final thought. What are the next milestones? In the agenda. What we talked a little bit about some of the things that we know are underway or coming. What's the sort of timescale or timings on some of the next important steps in this agenda? Heather, what are you looking out for?
I think, as I said, the viability PPG is the kind of missing piece on the grey belt policy.
Is there a time?
No, I don't. I'm not aware that the government's actually said. I'm expecting it fairly soon, but yeah, I can't point to anything more concrete than that. I don't know, Tom, whether you've got any inside information on that.
I haven't got any inside information on it, but in response to the House of Lords letter about grey belt, the minister said it will be said the spring for the viability. So how you define spring, I suppose, is
well, yeah, cool.
October then.
And other sort of important milestones, Heather, viability being one. Are there other ones that you're keeping an eye on, or we should be keeping an eye on?
I mean, I think after that, it's really more just about seeing what the practical reaction is from local planning authorities in particular. As I said, I'd expect any that are concerned that grey belt is going to completely undermine their green belt to, if they've got the cash, get on and start their own grey belt assessment. And certainly all of them have been, told to get on and do their reviews. But yeah, we all know that there is no particularly easily estimatable timeline for plan reviews because they tend to just take their own sweet time, unfortunately.
Yeah. Tom, what's some milestones? I mean, you talked a little, when do we think the Greenbelt reviews will get underway in seriousness? And do you think the big cities will, I mean, the big cities by definition have, all of them have, or most of them have Greenbelt, so it's a natural area for them to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, different paces for different people, but I think as part of the recent money that the government gave for plan making to various different local authorities, I think the GLA will be, if they haven't done already, will be kind of commencing their Greenbelt review imminently, so that those things will be happening. The other thing is national development management policies, and whether the Greenbelt and Grey Belt policies become national development management policies and therefore in theory have a greater legal status than they do currently. Having said that, inspectors seem to be treating them as on a par with local plan policies or superseding local plan policies anyway as a material consideration currently. But if they become national development management policies later in the year, then in theory they'll have a bit kind of greater legal weight. Heather might want to comment on that.
Heather, do you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Tom, actually. I'm always slightly, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but it is remarkable how often appeals in particular are won or lost on the basis of the NPPF, sort of irrespective of what the development plan says, and not always only when the development plan is old in terms of the number of years that have elapsed, but realistically, as soon as there's a shift in national policy, it can render local development plan policies much less effective, immediately. And I would be surprised if local plan development policies sort of stood in the way of the grey belt policy in the NPPF. I wouldn't expect that at all.
And final quick thought from you.
Yes, so Tom stole my idea. He knows the NDMPs are my favourite planning reform.
Yeah. I can
I'm
see
very
your
excited.
eyes. I can see your eyes light up, and I think Tom did it deliberately, knowing
Yes, he did.
that it's 1
Yeah,
o'clock.
I'm sure he did too.
You can't go on forever about it. So he did.
No.
He very
Yep.
specifically did
So
it.
apart from that, I think it's going to be obviously the government introduced in their planning bill the national scheme of delegation. I think when the regs for that are published, I mean, I don't know whether that'll be before the bill is passed or afterwards. They publish separately a working paper that sets out in their option 3, I think a very kind of bold and we think very positive set of reforms to the committee system. That, in conjunction with the NDMPs, I think offers a lot of potential for further reform in this area. However, the government decides to act on that.
Very good. A good note to finish on. Thank you to my panelists, Tom Dobson, Heather Sargent, and Breach. I hope you found that useful. This is definitely an area, as we've heard in the last 60 minutes, the government is very keen on and very proactive on, and actually has a clear sense as to what it's trying to do and the sequencing it needs to do it. So definitely an area for us to keep an eye on, which we definitely will. But until the next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks, Tom, Heather, and take care.